Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The woods have always been a second home to me. Tall trees, open skies, the earthy smell of pine and dirt. That weekend was supposed to be like all the others. 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Lauren, and Mike, have been doing these camping trips since high school. We'd sit around a fire, tell embarrassing stories, and drink a little too much. It was a tradition. That night, the fire crackled and danced as we roasted marshmallows and laughed about the stupid things we'd done growing up. Jake was mid-story about a prank he'd pulled on Mike when I heard it. My laugh, bouncing back at me from the dark forest beyond our campsite. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, maybe Mike mocking me, but no one else reacted. My laugh came again, slower this time, drawn out like someone was stretching it on a rack. It had a deep, raspy edge that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "What?" Jake said, looking up from his marshmallow. My laugh. It echoed back, but weirdly, they all went quiet, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Lauren leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "It's probably just the forest," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The fire crackled louder, throwing sparks into the cool night air. We sat in silence, listening, but there was nothing. No wind, no distant hoot of an owl, just the occasional pop of the fire and the weight of the woods pressing in on us. "See? You're imagining things," Sarah said, trying to sound reassuring. Maybe she was right, but then the shadows moved. At first, it was subtle, just the kind of thing you might mistake for shifting firelight. But soon, a shape started to emerge from the darkness, stepping between the trees. My heart thudded in my chest as the figure grew clearer, its movements jerky, like a puppet being dragged on strings. When it stepped into the firelight, I froze. It was me, not just someone who looked like me, exactly me. Same dark hair, same faded hoodie, same old hiking boots with the frayed laces. But there was something wrong with its face. Its smile was too wide, and its eyes were just a bit too large, gleaming like wet glass. My friends stared, their mouths hanging open. Jake dropped his marshmallow stick, the sound barely registering over the pounding in my ears. "What the hell?" Mike whispered. The doppelganger tilted its head and let out a low, guttural laugh. My laugh. But it wasn't coming from its throat. It was like the sound was being played on a speaker just behind its lips. It took a step closer. "Stay back," I shouted, jumping to my feet. The thing didn't stop. Instead, it mimicked me, raising its hand in the same defensive gesture. But then it spoke, and the words made my blood run cold. "You think they really like you?" it said, its voice warped and echoing. "They laugh at you, not with you." I stumbled backward. "Well, what are you talking about?" "You're the joke," it hissed, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The teeth. There were too many of them, sharp and glistening like a predator's. "They don't need you. They never did." My friends were dead silent. No one moved. No one even breathed. "That's not true," Lauren finally said, her voice trembling. The thing's head snapped toward her so fast it made an audible crack. Lauren yelped and scooted closer to Jake, her eyes wide with terror. "They're scared of you," it whispered, taking another step forward. Its movements were unnatural, like it was fighting against invisible restraints. "They wish you weren't here." I looked at my friends, hoping for reassurance, but their faces were pale, their eyes darting between me and the thing wearing my face. "Stop," I said, my voice breaking. "Whatever you are, just stop." It tilted its head again, and for a moment I thought it might actually listen. But then it lunged. The fire flared up, casting wild shadows as it rushed toward me, its too wide smile gleaming in the orange glow. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward and falling to the ground. My friend screamed, and Jake grabbed a burning stick from the fire, waving it at the creature. The thing paused, its head cocking again like a dog hearing a strange sound. Then it laughed, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the forest. Jake swung the stick, but it moved too fast, darting into the shadows before the burning wood could connect. "Everyone, get to the cars," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. We didn't pack up. We didn't grab our gear. We just ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted down the narrow trail toward the parking lot. The sound of that laughter followed us, growing louder, closer. When we reached the car, Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. "Drive," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike didn't need to be told twice. The tires spun in the gravel as we sped down the dirt road, leaving the campsite, and whatever the hell that thing was behind. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear it, my own laugh, echoing back at me from the corners of an empty room. And every time I look in the mirror, I wonder if the reflection staring back is really me. Story 2. The forest had an eerie way of swallowing sound. Every footstep, every breath seemed muffled, as if the woods themselves were trying to keep secrets. We were 3 days into our camping trip. Me, Danny, and Lisa. The plan was simple. Hike, camp, and forget about the stresses of the world. But when we stumbled across that lantern, everything changed. It was hanging from the lowest branch of a gnarled old tree. The tree itself looked ancient, its bark twisted into shapes that resembled screaming faces if you stared too long. The lantern swayed slightly in the breeze, casting a faint yellow glow that shouldn't have been possible. It looked antique, with rust eating away at its edges and a cracked glass pane. The ground beneath it was strange. No leaves, no grass, just bare, compacted dirt littered with old camping gear. A ripped sleeping bag, a broken thermos, and even a tattered hiking boot lay scattered around. "Looks like somebody packed light," Danny joked, but his voice had a nervous edge. "Yeah," Lisa added, her eyes locked on the lantern. "Maybe we should just go." But curiosity got the better of us, as it often does when you're young and stupid. I stepped closer, feeling the air grow colder with each step. The lantern's glow didn't waver, even when the wind picked up. "Think it's one of those ghost lights?" Danny said, grinning. He always had a way of making light of things, even when he shouldn't. Ghost lights don't exist, Lisa said, her voice firm, but she didn't take her eyes off the lantern. I reached out, hesitating just a moment before my fingers brushed the cold metal. The lantern swayed slightly at my touch, the light flickering for just a second. But then it stopped, hanging dead still, as if it were waiting for something. That's enough, Lisa said, pulling me back. Let's go. This place gives me the creeps. We turned and started walking, leaving the lantern behind. But after just a few steps, a loud creak echoed through the forest. We froze, turning back to see the lantern swinging violently back and forth, as though someone had shoved it hard. Okay, that's weird, Danny muttered. Let's just go. Lisa snapped, grabbing his arm. We didn't talk much as we hiked back to our campsite, the silence between us heavy. When we finally reached our tents, the sun was setting, and the woods were painted in deep orange and shadow. I'm not saying it was haunted or anything, Danny said as we sat around the fire, but that was creepy, right? Lisa didn't respond. She just poked to the fire with a stick, her face pale. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just an old lantern, nothing more. But as the night deepened, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It started with the footsteps, soft at first, almost like the rustle of leaves. Then they grew louder, more deliberate, circling the campsite. Danny and I grabbed flashlights, shining them into the trees, but we saw nothing. Probably just an animal, Danny said, but his voice trembled. Then came the breathing, heavy, labored breaths just outside the thin fabric of our tents. It moved from one tent to another, pausing in front of each, as though it was listening. I held my breath, clutching the handle of my knife, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The breathing stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Lisa screamed. I burst out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and saw her standing frozen, pointing at something just beyond the firelight. I followed her gaze, and my blood turned to ice. The lantern was there, hanging from a branch that wasn't there before, right outside our campsite. Its faint yellow glow seemed brighter now, almost blinding. That's impossible, Danny whispered. We left it behind. The ground beneath it was the same compacted dirt we'd seen earlier, but this time there were fresh footprints leading to it. Footprints that stopped at the lantern and went nowhere else. We need to leave, Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper. We didn't argue. We packed up in record time, the lantern's glow burning into my back as we worked. It felt like it was watching us, judging us. As we started hiking, the light followed, always just behind us, bobbing in the distance like a predator stalking its prey. We walked for hours, the lantern never straying far. The forest seemed endless. Every path we took looping back to where we started. Exhaustion set in, and with it, panic. This can't be happening, Danny said, his voice cracking. But it was happening. By the time we stopped, the sun was rising, and the lantern was gone. For a moment, we thought we were safe. But as the morning light filtered through the trees, we saw it. Etched into the bark of a nearby tree was the shape of the lantern, carved deep and fresh. Beneath it were three symbols, a boot, a sleeping bag, and a knife. We didn't understand then, but we do now. Danny disappeared 2 nights later. Lisa the night after that. I'm the last one left, writing this in a desperate attempt to warn anyone who finds this. If you see the lantern leave, don't touch it, don't look at it. And if it follows you, God help you. Story 3. The ranger wasn't kidding when he warned us about the Hunger Grove. At the time, we laughed it off. For city kids looking for a weekend adventure, thinking we were invincible. The forest was beautiful. After all, golden sunlight filtered through the tall pines, the smell of moss and earth heavy in the air. It didn't feel dangerous. Not yet. People vanished there, the ranger had said, his voice low like he didn't want the trees to overhear. They leave their gear behind, perfectly untouched. If you value your lives, don't set foot in that grove. Naturally, we went straight for it. The grove didn't seem any different from the rest of the forest. Maybe the trees were a little closer together, their trunks twisted in strange, unsettling ways, but that was it. As we pitched our tents, Kyle joked about the ghost trees eating us alive, making exaggerated chomping sounds as he hammered in the stakes. Sarah rolled her eyes while Abby punched his arm, laughing nervously. I just shook my head. Still, as the sun dipped lower, I noticed the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you expect in the woods. No birds, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Just nothing, like the grove was holding its breath. We lit a fire, trying to ignore the unease that crept in with the dark. Kyle told stupid ghost stories, and we laughed harder than we should have, as if our laughter could drown out the tension building between us. But when the fire started to die, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers weren't random. They said our names, soft and slow, like a lover murmuring in your ear. Arslan. I froze. Did you guys hear that? Hear what? Kyle asked, tossing another log on the fire. Someone just said my name. Abby shivered, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. I heard it too. It said mine. Sarah stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. It's probably the wind, or an echo or something, but there was no wind, not even a breeze. The trees stood unnaturally still, their branches as rigid as statues. We should have left then, packed up our tents, doused the fire, and run. But we didn't. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low groaning, like the earth itself was in pain. The ground beneath my sleeping bag shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then more violently. I unzipped my tent and stumbled out, my heart pounding. Kyle, Sarah, Abby, I shouted, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the dense, oppressive darkness. That's when I saw it. The forest floor was moving, rippling like the surface of a pond. Roots and vines writhed in the dirt, snaking their way toward the tents. I sprinted to Kyle's tent and unzipped it, shaking him awake. Get up, something's happening. He groaned, annoyed, but then his eyes widened as he noticed the movement outside. What the hell is that? Before I could answer, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the night. Abby! We ran to her tent and found her outside, thrashing against thick vines coiled around her legs. They were dragging her toward the grove's center, where the trees stood in an ominous circle, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Sarah was already there, trying to pull Abby free, but the vines were too strong. "Help me," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. Kyle and I grabbed Abby's arms, pulling with all our strength. The vines tightened, thorns slicing into her skin. She was screaming, begging us not to let go. Then the ground opened. It wasn't a hole. It was more like the forest itself split apart, revealing a chasm of writhing roots and black soil. The smell of decay hit us like a punch to the gut. Abby's eyes locked on mine, wide with terror. "Don't let me go." I didn't. I held on until my hands were raw, until the vines yanked so hard that her screams turned into a choked gurgle. And then she was gone, swallowed by the earth. Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Kyle just stood there, staring at the spot where Abby had disappeared, his face pale and empty. The grove was silent again, but the silence was heavier now, oppressive. The trees seemed closer, their trunks twisting toward us as if they were watching. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "No." Kyle nodded, grabbing Sarah by the arm and pulling her to her feet. We didn't bother packing our gear. We just ran. The forest didn't want us to leave. The ground bucked and shifted beneath our feet, roots snaking up to trip us. Branches reached down, clawing at our faces and clothes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Arslan, stay. Sarah, come back." Kyle tripped, falling hard. I turned to help him, but he waved me off. "Go. Get Sarah out of here." I didn't want to leave him, but the forest didn't give me a choice. The roots were closing in, and Sarah was screaming for me to keep moving. We broke through the tree line just as the first rays of sunlight lit up the horizon. The moment we were out, the forest went still, like nothing had happened. The ranger found us hours later, huddled by the side of the road. We tried to explain what had happened, but he just shook his head. "Another one," he muttered under his breath. They sent a search party into the grove, but they didn't find anything. No Abby, no Kyle, no tents or gear. Just an empty stretch of forest, quiet and undisturbed. Sarah and I never went camping again. We don't talk about that night. Sometimes, though, I hear whispers when I'm alone, and I know the forest isn't done with me. Story 4. Camping in the middle of nowhere was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the chaos of the city. Just me and my two best friends, Eric and Danny, under a sky full of stars, surrounded by towering pines. We planned to spend 3 nights by the lake, fishing during the day and trading ghost stories by the fire at night. It was the second day when things started to feel off. We were returning to camp after a long afternoon on the water, dragging a net full of trout. The sun was dipping low, casting golden streaks over the lake, and everything felt perfect. But as we got closer to the clearing where our tents were set up, something didn't look right. "Did one of you set up another tent?" I asked, stopping dead in my tracks. Eric, who was carrying the cooler, frowned. "What are you talking about?" Danny squinted ahead. "Oh, come on. That wasn't there this morning. There were now 4 tents in our camp, identical to ours, down to the colors and style. Blue domes with gray trim." My stomach twisted. Maybe someone else showed up while we were gone. Eric shook his head. No way. We'd have seen or heard them coming down the trail. We stood there for a moment, just staring. The fourth tent was tucked a little farther back than the others, half hidden by some bushes, as if whoever set it up didn't want it to be noticed. "Let's go check it out," Danny said, slinging his fishing rod over his shoulder. I wanted to tell him it was a bad idea. Everything about that tent screamed that it didn't belong, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I followed him, Eric close behind. The closer we got, the colder the air seemed to feel. Danny reached out and unzipped the front flap. Inside, there was a single sleeping bag, neatly rolled up, and nothing else. No backpack, no clothes, no food. But the smell hit us instantly. Something sour and metallic, like rust and old sweat. "Guess they packed light," Danny joked, but his voice wavered. I stared at the sleeping bag, my pulse quickening. There was no dust on it, no leaves or dirt. It was too clean, like it had been placed there just seconds ago. That night, we tried to ignore it. We sat around the campfire, eating our trout and joking about how maybe Bigfoot had joined us on the trip. Danny even made a crude drawing in the dirt, a hairy creature holding a marshmallow stick. But the fourth tent loomed in the background, its shadow flickering in the firelight. We didn't talk about it again until we were settling in for the night. "I'm telling you," Eric whispered, his voice muffled by the fabric of his tent. "It's probably just some hiker passing through. They'll be gone by morning." "Yeah," Danny agreed from his own tent. "Nothing to worry about." I didn't respond. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't restful. I dreamt I was back in the clearing, standing in front of the stranger's tent. The flap was open now, and a man stood just inside. He was tall and thin, with dark, sunken eyes and pale skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His hair was slicked back, too perfect like a mannequin's. He didn't move, didn't blink. In the dream, I stepped closer, drawn to him even though my mind screamed at me to stop. And then he moved, slowly, deliberately. He leaned forward until his face was inches from mine. His breath smelled like rotten meat, and when he smiled, I saw his teeth were sharp, jagged, like broken glass. "Do you know me?" he whispered, his voice low and wet. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The air inside my tent felt stifling, too warm. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam trembling as I shone it around. Empty, just my sleeping bag and gear. But when I glanced at the tent flap, I froze. There was a handprint smeared across the fabric, a long, pale handprint, too big to belong to any of us. In the morning, the fourth tent was gone. Eric and Danny didn't notice at first. They were too busy packing up, eager to head home. But I couldn't stop staring at the empty patch of dirt where it had been. "You okay, man?" Danny asked, slapping me on the back. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Did either of you hear anything last night?" I asked. Eric shook his head. "No, slept like a rock." Danny laughed. "Same here. You sure you didn't just have a bad dream?" I wanted to tell them about the handprint, but I stopped myself. What would I even say? They wouldn't believe me. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the fourth tent reappear, or worse, the man from my dream. But the forest remained still, quiet. It's been weeks now, and I can't stop thinking about him. About the way his face looked so familiar, like someone I should recognize but didn't. Sometimes, I see him in my peripheral vision, standing at the edge of a parking lot, watching from a crowded cafe. He's never there when I turn to look, but I know it's him. I've started dreaming about him again, too. Last night he spoke to me. "Do you know me?" he asked, his voice echoing in my head. This time, I answered, "No. Who are you?" His smile widened, showing those broken glass teeth. "You'll remember soon," he said. I woke up screaming, and now, as I sit here writing this, I realize something I've been avoiding. The fourth tent wasn't identical to ours. It was a mirror image, everything flipped backwards. I don't know what that means, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. Story 5. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me, my best friend Tommy, his younger brother Will, and our buddy Mike. Just 4 guys out in the woods, getting away from the noise of the city. We picked a clearing near the edge of the forest, a spot secluded enough to feel like an adventure, but close enough to the trailhead that we wouldn't get lost. The day was great. We hiked, fished in the creek, and cooked a dinner of hot dogs and canned beans over the campfire. The laughter came easy, the kind that bubbles up when you've been friends forever. By the time night fell, we were all relaxed, a little tired, and settled around the fire with blankets wrapped around our shoulders. That's when I first noticed it. The fire was dying down, embers glowing soft and orange, when my eyes caught something off to the right. A shadow, long and angular, stretched across the trees. At first, I thought it was one of us casting it, maybe Mike shifting in his seat. But when I looked at him, he wasn't moving. Nobody was. "Hey," I said, my voice breaking the quiet. "Does that shadow look weird to you?" Tommy frowned, following my gaze. "What shadow?" "That one," I said, pointing. Now everyone was staring. The shadow was still there, its shape sharp and human-like, but wrong in some way I couldn't quite explain. The head was tilted to the side like a curious dog, but more twisted, like it didn't understand how heads were supposed to work. "It's probably just the fire," Mike said after a pause, but his voice wasn't as steady as usual. "You know how light messes with shadows." "Yeah," Will chimed in, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "It's just the fire. Nothing spooky." But the thing was, as we shifted and moved, the shadow didn't. Not even a little. It stood perfectly still, like it wasn't tethered to anything real. "Let's test it," Tommy said, grabbing a stick from the pile of firewood. He waved it in front of the flames, casting long, jittery shadows on the trees. But the shadow didn't change. It stayed exactly the same, even as the fire's light flickered and danced. "I don't like this," Will muttered. He was the youngest, just barely 19, and he looked pale. "It's fine," Mike said, but he didn't sound fine. None of us did. Then the shadow stepped forward. I swear to God, it moved. It didn't slide or grow, like shadows usually do. It stepped, one jagged, deliberate motion, and stopped just at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, none of us breathed. "Okay," I said, my voice cracking. "This isn't funny anymore. Who's doing this?" "Nobody," Tommy whispered. "It's not us." The firelight didn't touch the shadow. Even as it stood closer, it stayed a deep, impenetrable black. darker than the night around it. And then the air turned cold. Not the kind of cold you'd expect in the woods at night. This was sharp and sudden, a bone-deep chill that made our breath cloud in front of us. "Do we run?" Will asked, his voice barely audible. "Where?" Mike hissed. "We can't see anything out there." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the shadow, which was stepping closer again, moving like a marionette on invisible strings. And then it stopped. We sat frozen, staring at the thing as it stood just beyond the firelight. It didn't make a sound, didn't waver or flicker like shadows should. It was solid and heavy, and when I squinted, I thought I saw something shifting within it like smoke trapped inside glass. "Let's just put out the fire," Tommy whispered. "Maybe if we—" Before he could finish, the shadow tilted its head the other way, the motion sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Then it raised an arm, or something like an arm, and pointed directly at me. My breath caught. It was as though someone had dumped ice water over my head. "Why is it pointing?" Will asked, his voice high-pitched. I shook my head, unable to speak. The shadow's arm stayed raised, motionless, but its head was twisting now, turning slowly around in a full circle. "We're leaving," I said finally, my voice shaking. "Grab the lanterns. Now." Tommy scrambled for the lanterns while Mike tried to stamp out the fire. The shadow didn't move, but the cold deepened, and I swear I could hear something faint, a low, rumbling sound, almost like laughter. We didn't pack up. We didn't even grab all our gear. We just ran. The trail back to the car was a nightmare. The cold followed us, biting at our heels, and every so often, I'd glance back and see it, the shadow, now flitting between the trees, moving faster than anything had a right to. We made it to the car, panting and shaking, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. Nobody spoke until we were miles away, the forest long behind us. "What the hell was that?" Will finally asked, his voice trembling. None of us answered, because deep down, I don't think any of us wanted to know. The next day, we reported the incident to the local ranger station, leaving out the details that made us sound crazy. They told us people get spooked in the woods all the time, especially at night. But I could tell they didn't believe their own words. I haven't been camping since, and I never will again, because sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I see it. The shadow that shouldn't have been there, the cold that shouldn't have followed us. And I hear it too, that low, rumbling laugh. It's waiting. Somewhere out there, it's waiting. Story 6. It started as a simple camping trip. A weekend getaway for 5 of us looking to escape the dull grind of work and responsibility. The plan was to hike, fish, and sleep under the stars, just like we used to when we were kids. It was supposed to be fun. We pitched our tents on a flat stretch of ground overlooking the lake. I remember how it seemed to glow under the early evening sun, still and perfect, like a postcard come to life. The water reflected the towering pine trees surrounding it and the clear blue sky above. It was so quiet, almost unnaturally so. "This is the spot," Josh said, slapping his hands together. Couldn't ask for a better view. He was right. It was beautiful, but something about the lake made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the water didn't ripple, even with the breeze stirring the trees. Maybe it was the silence, No frogs croaking, no birds calling. Just the faint sound of wind moving through the forest. By the time we unpacked and got the fire going, the unease had dulled. The lake wasn't eerie anymore. It was serene, inviting even. Josh and Kelly dared each other to take a swim, stripping down to their swimsuits and running in like kids at summer camp. Their laughter echoed across the water, breaking the stillness. "Come on, man," Josh shouted to me. "Water's great." I dipped a toe in. It was warm, which was strange because the air had that cool bite of early autumn. Encouraged, I waded in. The water wasn't just warm. It was thick, almost oily. It clung to my skin in a way that made me want to rub it off. "Feel that?" I asked, but Josh and Kelly were too busy splashing each other to notice. "Don't be weird," my girlfriend Mia said as she floated on her back nearby. "It's just a lake." It didn't feel like just a lake. By the time night fell, we were all back at the campsite, full of roasted marshmallows and cheap beer. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the star-filled sky. The lake was still visible through the trees, a black mirror reflecting the moonlight. That's when we saw the ripples. "Did you see that?" Kelly asked, pointing toward the water. The surface was disturbed, as if something large had moved just beneath it. We all froze, watching the ripples fade into stillness. "Probably a fish," Josh said, but his voice lacked conviction. We tried to ignore it, but the mood had shifted. The laughter was quieter now, the stories less animated. Every so often, one of us would glance toward the lake, watching for more movement. It was around midnight when I saw them, the eyes. At first, I thought it was just the moonlight reflecting off the water. But then there were more of them, dozens, then hundreds of tiny, glowing orbs, all hovering just beneath the surface. "Guys," I whispered, pointing toward the lake. Everyone turned to look, and I heard Kelly gasp. "What the hell is that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unflinching, unfeeling. They weren't animal eyes. They were too round, too human. Josh, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and stood. "Let's check it out." "Are you insane?" Mia hissed, grabbing his arm. "It's just a trick of the light," he said, shaking her off. "There's nothing out there." I wanted to stop him, but part of me needed to know what was out there too. We followed him to the shore, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The eyes didn't move. They just watched. "Maybe it's algae or something," Kelly offered, though her voice was shaking. Josh leaned over the edge of the lake, the flashlight in one hand, his other reaching toward the water. "Don't touch it," I snapped, but it was too late. The water erupted. A hand, pale and bloated, shot out of the lake, its fingers curling around Josh's wrist. It pulled him with a strength that didn't seem possible, dragging him toward the black depths. "Help me," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. We grabbed him, all three of us pulling as hard as we could. But whatever was in the water was stronger. It yanked again, and Josh's head went under, his screams muffled by the water. And then silence. The lake was still again. The eyes were gone. The only sound was our ragged breathing. We called for him, screamed his name until our throats were raw, but there was no answer. The water, didn't even ripple. We didn't sleep that night. None of us spoke as we sat huddled by the fire, too scared to look at the lake, too scared to look away. By morning, Josh was still missing. His flashlight was on the shore, the beam dim and flickering. The rest of us packed up in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake one last time. It looked the same as it had when we arrived. Calm, beautiful, inviting. But I knew better now. The lake wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Story 7. When I first saw the clearing, I knew we should turn back. There was something off about the place, like it didn't belong to this world. The trees around it were thin, almost skeletal, their branches gnarled and twisted into shapes that resembled clutching hands. But it was the stones that stopped us in our tracks. The ground was littered with jagged, irregular rocks, each about the size of a football. At first glance, they were just ordinary stones, gray and rough, weathered by years of exposure. But when the wind passed through the clearing, I swear I heard something. It wasn't the low rustle of leaves or the whistle of air through the trees. No, it sounded like faint, distant screams. We were 5 in total. Me, Tyler, Brandon, Lila, and my cousin Jamie. Tyler, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's just wind," he said, stepping into the clearing. "You guys are letting your imaginations run wild." But the rest of us hung back, staring at the stones. The more I looked, the more I noticed something unsettling. Each stone was shaped like a face, not carved or sculpted, but naturally formed, if you could call it natural. They were twisted and contorted, mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. "Man, these are freaky," Jamie muttered, crouching near one. His voice was uneasy, a rare thing for him. "They look alive." "Alive?" Tyler snorted. "Come on, they're just rocks." He picked up one of the stones and held it aloft like it was some kind of trophy. "See? No big deal." The moment he touched it, the wind changed. The faint screams grew louder, sharper, almost as if the clearing itself was angry. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, a low, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. "Tyler, put it back," Lila snapped, her voice trembling. "Seriously?" But Tyler being Tyler, he smirked and tucked the stone into his backpack. "Relax, it's just a souvenir. I'll put it on my desk and tell everyone it's cursed." Good story, right? That night, back at camp, none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. We'd pitched our tents a little ways from the clearing, near a small stream. The fire crackled in the center of our circle, casting long shadows that danced against the trees. But no matter how bright the flames burned, the darkness beyond felt alive, pressing in like a physical weight. Tyler was the first to fall asleep, snoring loudly in his tent. The rest of us stayed up, too jittery to close our eyes. Jamie kept glancing toward the clearing. "I don't like this," he said. "We shouldn't have come here. We'll leave in the morning," I assured him. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure we'd make it that long. Around midnight, I heard it again, the screaming, faint at first, like it was carried on the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside the tents. "Did you hear that?" Lila whispered, her face pale in the firelight. Before I could answer, Tyler let out a blood-curdling scream from his tent. We all jumped to our feet, scrambling toward him. "Tyler, what's wrong?" I shouted, fumbling with the zipper on his tent. When we got inside, he was sitting up, drenched in sweat, his eyes wild. In his lap was the stone. "What the hell?" Jamie breathed. "How'd that get here?" "I don't know." Tyler stammered. "I didn't put it there. I swear." "Throw it back," Lila said firmly. "Now." Tyler nodded, grabbing the stone with shaking hands. We followed him as he marched toward the clearing, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The moment we stepped into the clearing, the air grew colder. The screams were deafening now, a cacophony of pain and despair that made my skin crawl. Tyler hurled the stone back onto the pile and ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the tents, panting and wide-eyed. That night, none of us slept. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, felt like a threat. And when dawn finally broke, bringing a pale, gray light, we were ready to pack up and leave. But Tyler was gone. We tore through his tent, calling his name, searching the woods. His boots were still by the fire, his pack untouched. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Then Jamie screamed. We ran to him, our stomachs sinking as we realized he was standing at the edge of the clearing. "Don't come any closer," he said, his voice shaking. I stepped forward anyway and saw what had him frozen in place. There, among the jagged stones, was a new face. Tyler's face. It was unmistakable, his crooked nose, his wide-set eyes, his mouth twisted in a scream that would haunt me forever. We didn't stay to find out what had taken him. We grabbed our gear and ran, leaving the woods behind. To this day, I don't know what those stones were or how they claimed Tyler. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear the screams again. And I know, deep down, that he's still out there, still screaming. Story 8. There were 4 of us, me, Sam, Lena, and Chris. We were out for a weekend of camping, deep in the Appalachian woods, miles away from cell phone service and the usual noise of life. The trip had started as a way to blow off steam. We'd all been dealing with our own crap. Work stress, breakups, family drama. Out here, it was supposed to be simple. Sam was the one who suggested we take the shortcut. Trail's too long, he'd said, brushing a hand through his shaggy blonde hair. I checked the map. If we cut through here, we'll shave an hour off. Chris hesitated. He was always the cautious one, the guy who triple-checked everything and carried 2 first aid kits. "We're not supposed to leave the trail," he said. "It's how people get lost." "Relax," Sam shot back with a grin. "It's not like the forest's gonna eat us." Famous last words. We followed him off the trail, stepping into the untamed forest. At first, it wasn't bad. The ground was soft but manageable, covered in pine needles and moss. We joked about being adventurers blazing a new path. Even Chris seemed to relax, though he kept glancing back toward the trail. It started to change about an hour in. The trees got denser, their branches tangling overhead to block out the sunlight. The air grew heavy, like we were walking through water. Even our voices felt muted, swallowed up by the woods. When we stopped for a break, Sam pulled out his map, his confidence faltering. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "The trail should be back there." We didn't walk that far. I glanced back, but the path we'd come from was gone. Completely gone. The ground looked untouched, like no one had ever walked there. My stomach twisted. Lena tried to laugh it off. Maybe we just turn around? Let's head back and retrace our steps. But no matter which way we went, the forest looked the same. It was as if the trees were shifting behind us, erasing any sign of where we'd been. By the time the sun began to sink, the tension between us had grown sharp. Sam wouldn't admit he was lost, but it was written all over his face. Chris kept muttering under his breath, something about how we shouldn't have left the trail. Lena stuck close to me, her fingers brushing mine every few steps like she needed the reassurance that someone else was still there. Then we saw him. It started as a shape on a hill, silhouetted against the orange-pink sky. A person standing still and watching us. Finally, Sam said, relief flooding his voice. "Someone who can help." He waved at the figure, yelling, "Hey, over here." The figure raised an arm and waved back. I should have been relieved too, but my chest felt tight. Something about the way they moved was off. Their arm jerked up like a puppet on strings, stiff and unnatural. Chris stepped forward, squinting. "Wait, is that?" His voice faltered. It hit me at the same time. The figure was wearing a red hoodie. The same red hoodie Chris had been wearing earlier, until he'd changed into a jacket when it got cooler. Lena's grip on my arm tightened. "That's Chris." "No," Chris said, shaking his head. "That's not possible. I'm right here." But as we got closer, there was no denying it. The figure on the hill was an exact copy of Chris. Same height, same build, same scruffy beard. Even the same nervous tick. The way he scratched at his wrist when he was uncomfortable. "Who the hell are you?" Sam called out, his voice cracking slightly. The other Chris didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at us with hollow, empty eyes. "Let's go back," I said, panic bubbling in my throat. "We don't need to go near him." But the moment I said it, the other Chris started walking toward us. Slowly at first, then faster. His movements were jerky, like something was pushing him forward. Sam grabbed a branch from the ground, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted. The other Chris didn't stop. When he was close enough, I saw it. His face wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dark, the skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones. And when he opened his mouth to speak, the voice that came out wasn't Chris's. It wasn't even human. Lost, it said, the word rasping and broken. "You're all lost." We ran. Branches whipped at my face, and the air burned in my lungs. But I didn't stop. None of us did. The sound of footsteps followed us, heavy and relentless, like they were pounding directly into my skull. I don't know how long we ran. The forest seemed endless, stretching on forever. Finally, we burst into a clearing, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped. We turned, expecting to see the other Chris. But he was gone. Instead, there were more figures now. 4 of them, standing at the edge of the clearing. Each one of them looked like us. I stared at my double, my head spinning. It smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only hunger. "Where do we go?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Sam didn't answer. He was staring at his double, his knuckles white as he gripped the branch. Chris stepped forward, his face pale. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the figures didn't care what we believed. They started walking toward us, their movements slow and deliberate. I don't know what happens if they catch you, and I don't want to find out. We ran again, deeper into the forest, praying for a way out. But I can feel it now. The forest isn't just a place. It's alive, watching us, playing with us. And it doesn't want us to leave. Story 9. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Nothing more than a break from work and the constant buzz of city life. Just me, my sister Karen, her boyfriend Josh, and our cousin Dan. We'd camped dozens of times before, always in the same general area, safe, predictable. But that weekend, Josh had found a new spot. It's deeper in the woods, he said, grinning like a kid who'd just found buried treasure. No noise from the roads, no other people, just us and nature. We should have known better. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and barely marked. By the time we reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, painting the trees in long, golden shadows. We set up the tents near a fallen log, not far from a small stream. It was peaceful, serene even. That first night, as we sat around the campfire, I heard it, faint giggles drifting through the trees. You hear that? I asked, cocking my head. Hear what? Dan said, jabbing a marshmallow onto his stick. Laughter, like kids or something. Karen rolled her eyes. It's probably the wind. You always overthink stuff, but it didn't sound like the wind. The sound was light, airy, but unnatural, as if it didn't belong there. It came in waves, barely audible at first, then fading completely. I shook it off, convincing myself Karen was right. The second day passed uneventfully. We hiked, fished, and played cards by the fire. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the giggling started again. Louder this time. Okay, now I hear it, Karen said, clutching her jacket. Maybe there's another campsite nearby, Josh offered. He looked around, but his voice lacked conviction. There's no one else out here, Dan said, his brow furrowed. We haven't seen a single person all day. The laughter didn't stop. It circled us, moving between the trees. No matter where we looked, we couldn't pinpoint its source. That night, none of us slept well. The sound seemed closer, more distinct, as if whoever or whatever was laughing was right outside the tents. I lay awake, heart pounding, every snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. When dawn finally came, we emerged from the tents to find footprints all around the campsite. Small barefoot prints. Kids, Karen whispered, her face pale, in the middle of nowhere. Dan said, no way, this is messed up. Josh crouched near one of the tracks. They're fresh, he said, but they're weird. We looked closer. The footprints weren't quite right. The toes were long, almost claw-like, and the impressions were too deep for something so small. I don't like this, Karen said, her voice trembling. Let's pack up and leave, I said. But Josh was stubborn. We got one more night. Let's not overreact. Reluctantly, we stayed. That evening, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the usual sounds of nature. Birds, crickets, rustling leaves were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. By nightfall, The giggling returned, louder than ever. It wasn't playful anymore. It was shrill, distorted, and filled with malice. "They're mocking us," Karen said, clutching my arm. "Who's they?" Josh snapped. "I don't know," she yelled, her voice cracking. "But it's not just the wind." We huddled around the fire, too afraid to retreat to the tents. Shadows danced between the trees, but whenever we shined a flashlight, there was nothing there. Then around midnight, the laughter stopped. The silence was worse, and that's when we saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They watched us from the edge of the clearing, unblinking. "Get the hell out of here," Dan shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and waving it toward the woods. The eyes didn't move, but the laughter came back, louder and more guttural, like a chorus of broken voices. We bolted. We didn't pack, didn't grab anything but the flashlights. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the laughter following us, growing more frenzied with every step. I glanced back once and wished I hadn't. They were behind us, small figures with elongated limbs and two wide grins, their hollow eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Keep running," Josh yelled, his voice ragged. The trail seemed endless. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't dare stop. The giggling was everywhere now, echoing in my head, seeping into my bones. When we finally burst out of the woods and onto the dirt road where we'd parked, the laughter stopped. We didn't speak as we piled into the car, didn't look back as we sped away. The silence inside the car was thick, heavy with the weight of what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until we were miles away that I dared to breathe easy. Do you think it's over?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, but as I pulled into my driveway that night, I heard it again. Faint, distorted laughter drifting through the air. The woods hadn't let us go. They'd followed us home. Story 10. We'd been driving for hours, the road long and endless, the air growing thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Our goal was simple: a weekend away, just the five of us, my friends and me, looking for a break from the mundane, the usual stress, work, school, life, and everything in between. There was something peaceful about the idea of sleeping under the stars, around a crackling fire, away from the constant hum of city noise. No plans, no deadlines, just us in the woods. But when we finally reached the campgrounds, something wasn't right. It was supposed to be just another quiet spot by the lake, far enough off the beaten path that it wasn't overcrowded. But as soon as we parked, I felt it, like the air was too still, almost too thick to breathe. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't say anything, but I could tell my friends felt it too. Ben, the quiet one of the group, kept looking over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the woods like he was expecting something to come out of the trees. "Let's get this set up," Sarah said, trying to break the silence. She always knew how to keep things moving, and if there was one person who could turn a weird vibe into something fun, it was her. We started unloading the gear, setting up our tents, and unpacking the cooler. It didn't take long, and soon we were all sitting around the fire pit, popping open beers and cracking jokes. Everything felt normal, but something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. That's when I saw it. In the center of the clearing, a campfire was already burning. At first, I thought maybe someone else had set it up before leaving. Campers who'd gone off for a hike or to fish, but there was no sign of them. No gear left behind. No trace of life except for the fire. I figured it was one of those weird coincidences where the fire was just smoldering from the night before. Still, it was odd. The flames danced, crackling merrily, though the air around us was damp. And it wasn't the kind of night you'd expect a fire to keep burning for long. Who set this up? I asked, looking around. Probably some random campers. Ben muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Maybe we should just leave it alone. But we didn't leave it alone. Instead, we sat down around the fire, the warmth spreading through the air, and for a while it was nice. The flickering orange light bathed everything in an almost surreal glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The flames kept roaring, undisturbed by the dampness of the night. Hours passed, and still the fire never dimmed. I've never seen a fire last this long, Sarah said, leaning forward to poke the logs. We should probably let it die down a bit, right? I'll get some more wood, I said, standing up. I walked over to where our pile of firewood was stacked, but when I turned back to the fire, I froze. The flames were different. They were moving in a way that wasn't natural. The fire seemed to bend and twist as if something or someone was inside it, shifting, trying to break free. At first, it was subtle, a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearer. Faces, twisted and distorted, flickering in the flames, their features elongated and stretched. Some were screaming, others just staring, their eyes wide and unblinking. Their mouths moved, but no sound came from them, only the crackling of the fire. My heart raced, and I quickly turned away, feeling a cold chill settle in my bones. But when I looked back, the faces were still there, clearer now, more defined, as if they were reaching for me, pulling at the edges of the fire. The air around me felt thicker, heavier, as though the flames themselves were alive and watching us. What the hell? Ben whispered, his voice low, strained. He had noticed it too. Sarah stared into the fire, her face pale, her mouth hanging open. This isn't right, she said, her voice shaking. It's like something's trapped in there. I wanted to say something, to laugh it off, but I couldn't. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. It was as if the fire had become a window into something dark, something otherworldly. I looked around at my friends, trying to find something, anything that could explain what we were seeing, but they were just as lost as I was. The night dragged on, the fire never flickering out, never slowing. We tried to douse it with water, to smother it with dirt, but the flames roared back to life, stronger, angrier. They seemed to fight back, pushing the water away like it wasn't even there. The fire burned hotter and brighter, and the faces within it grew more distinct, their eyes following our every movement. But it wasn't just faces anymore. As I stared into the flames, I saw hands. Twisted, grotesque hands reaching out from the fire, their fingers stretching toward us like they were trying to grab us, pull us into the heat. I backed away, my legs shaking. This is insane. We need to leave. But before we could do anything, the ground beneath us trembled. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, but then it grew, like the earth itself was alive and angry. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. One of our group, Jake, the loudest one of us, was gone. I hadn't seen him leave, hadn't heard him move, but suddenly his tent was empty. I called out for him, but my voice seemed swallowed by the wind. "Jake!" I yelled. "Where the hell are you?" But there was no answer. We searched the campsite, calling his name, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. His belongings were still there, but he was nowhere to be found. And then, as if the fire had somehow called to us, his face appeared. It wasn't in the flames at first, but then it emerged, flickering in the heart of the fire. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. His face twisted, pulling at the edges of his skin, stretching until it was almost unrecognizable. It wasn't Jake anymore. It was a thing, something that wasn't human. We couldn't tear our eyes away. It felt like something was holding us there, as if we were being drawn into the fire itself. But I didn't want to go closer. I didn't want to see what would happen if we did. And then the fire screamed, not with sound, but with a terrible energy, a vibration that I felt deep in my chest. The ground beneath us shook, and the flames seemed to grow taller, wilder. The air burned with heat that didn't belong in a forest at night. "Get in the car," I shouted, turning to my friends, my voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "Now, move!" We ran, as fast as we could, not looking back, not daring to glance at the fire. When we reached the car, we drove away, tires screeching, the fire still burning in the rearview mirror. I don't know what happened to Jake. I don't know if we'll ever find out. But I do know this. The fire never died. And whatever it was that called us, whatever it was that trapped Jake inside the flames, it's still out there, waiting for the next group to wander too close. And it will never, ever let you leave.